And I guess the next speaker, Kevin Noone, co-leader of the Global Environmental Change theme here at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, will talk more about these issues. And I will ask you the same question as I asked Johan. What made you interested in all these issues from the very first beginning?
That goes back a ways.
Yeah.
That goes back a ways. I think there were actually two things that got me interested in this. One was the wonderful image when I was a kid of the Earth rising above the moon, taken from the Apollo, one of the Apollo spacecraft. That was just so stunning that I still remember it, just almost in a physical sense. The other one is a little bit more mundane. It's Star Trek. I wanted to be Mr. Spock. I didn't want to be like Mr. Spock. I wanted to be Mr. Spock. So.
You don't have his ears.
I'm working on the ears. I'm seeing if I can have them surgically altered or something. It'd be a little more pointy. But that was those were the things that got me started.
Yeah, that's good. It's good with different type of inspirations.
Thank you, Per. Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. My name's Kevin Noone. I split my time between two places. One of them is here with Johan and Kalle Folke at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. The other place is this one. It's a new secretariat called the Swedish Secretariat for Environmental Earth System Sciences. You have to take a deep breath to say that all at once. It's a cooperation between the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and four of our major funding agencies, FAS, Formas, Vinnova, and Vetenskapsrådet. And I'm delighted to say that as of yesterday, we have a secondment from here at Sida in our secretariat for the next 2 years. And I'm absolutely just thrilled that we have that collaboration together with Sida, the development agency. What will we talk about today? I think you on that side of the room actually have the better colors on that display. This one's a little bit washed out, and I'll be showing lots of colored slides, and I don't really know where to point. So I'll probably point at both of them. We'll talk a little bit about the basics of ocean acidification. I'm going to show some of the same plots that both Johans, I'm not Johan, by the way, that both Johans showed before this. Talk about some of the impacts, and then end the presentation with hopefully what will lead to some discussions afterwards, and that's connections to development. So first off, I want to acknowledge some people who provided both material and certainly a lot of inspiration for what's in this presentation. Terry Garcia, whose images you'll see at the end of the presentation, or at least a couple of them from National Geographic. Alex Rogers from the London Zoo. Carol Turley, who is one of the world's experts on ocean acidification. Another picture of the Earth floating in space. This isn't the one that rose above, well, it is the same planet that rose above the moon in the 1960s. But really the appropriate bullet point is down towards the bottom. Oceans contain about 90% of the biomass on the planet. There's a lot of life in the oceans. That life, among other things, does some fairly nice ecosystem services for us, like provide every other breath that we take, the oxygen in every other breath. It's kind of an important ecosystem, and we need to know how we are affecting it. So, the basics of ocean acidification. The title on the program said something about geochemistry. This is about the only chemistry you're going to be getting, at least in any formal sense. So don't worry if this is alarming. It'll be short. We'll start off with carbon dioxide. And as the second Johan mentioned, of all of the carbon dioxide that we emit to the atmosphere, only about half of it stays there. The other half is taken up by terrestrial ecosystems or marine ecosystems, about 50-50 each way. So 25% ends up in terrestrial systems, 25% ends up in marine systems, and that varies from year to year. A little bit. One of the results of that carbon dioxide going into the world's oceans is that it can ionize, essentially. And for you, well, you've been pointing at that all day long. I'll point at this one for a little bit over here. We have carbon dioxide dissolved into the oceans as a gas. It dissociates, it turns into ions, releasing protons. That makes the oceans more acidic. The more H plus thingies you have running around in the oceans, the more acidic the oceans become. And it also eventually can decrease the carbonate concentration. And bugs and things that make calcium carbonate, limestone essentially, need that stuff. And if the oceans become more acidic, there's less of that stuff available for those bugs to make hard shells of. We'll get a little bit technical. There's two major kinds of calcium carbonate that these things in the oceans can make. One's called aragonite, the other is called calcite. Aragonite is slightly less stable in terms of ocean acidity. But the important part to remember is as we add carbon dioxide to the oceans, they become more acidic. The oceans aren't acid, but they are acidifying as time goes on. Johan showed this plot before, but it's worth actually repeating because it's an important one. This is oceanic pH, ocean acidity, as a function of time from 25 million years ago to the present time. And you can see that ocean acidity, as well as we can measure it, has varied between a little bit over 8 to just over 8.3 pH units over those 25 million years, and it goes up and down slightly. But then we just dropped off a cliff. Here's the before the Industrial Revolution, here's where we are essentially today, and here's where we're heading in the future. That is a precipice. That's a very, very rapid change in ocean acidity, and it's happening essentially because we are pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Clearly that will have some sort of effect on ocean ecosystems. Of all that CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere, there was some wonderful work that was done about 6 years ago by Chris Sabine and a whole football team of other authors, where they did a combination of measurements and model calculations to try to trace where the CO2 that we have emitted, the fossil CO2, has ended up in the oceans. And let me back up, make one more point. There was a question earlier as to, the oceans being seen as this, they're huge. There's lots of water in the oceans. We can dump stuff into the oceans and it just disappears. Well, even marine geochemists sort of had that idea until about 10 years ago, that the oceans are just so big that regardless of how much CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, it's not going to make a difference. Wrong, Ola. It does make a difference. So what this bunch did was they looked and traced where our carbon has ended up in the oceans. And you might think originally, or just if you don't think about it too much, that it should all just sort of spread out and end up in the oceans pretty evenly, because CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is distributed pretty evenly around the planet. Well, it doesn't. A lot of the CO2 that we have emitted has ended up here in the North Atlantic. Compared to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the Atlantic is more full of our carbon than the other ocean basins are. And there's this band in the Southern Ocean of increased carbon concentration. It's where our carbon has ended up. What effects might that have? Johan showed these as well, but they're also worth repeating because these are essentially a map of how much we have acidified the oceans. The colors, the deep greens are really good conditions. This, whatever color that is, kind of fluorescent yellowish sort of thing, are adequate conditions for the kinds of organisms that make aragonite, one of those forms of calcium carbonate. The more deeper yellow conditions are marginal. The red ones, you don't want to go. That really is a red zone. If we look at the map, and this is actually aragonite saturation, that's more chemistry stuff. Think of this as ocean pH, essentially. So if we look at 1870, before the Industrial Revolution really kicked in, we can see that most of the tropical oceans, now we're looking mostly at the Pacific here, most of the tropical oceans and all those blue dots, which are major coral reefs, were in areas that were optimal for that kind of organism, for the kind of organism that forms aragonite. If we look at the roughly current conditions from some years ago, this was when atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide were 375 ppm. They're almost 390 now. This is what the map looks like. There's a little patch here in the tropical Pacific Ocean, which is still optimal, but the rest of the oceans are, at best, adequate. If we look into the future a little bit farther, by 2030, you really have to look hard. In the Caribbean here, there's one tiny little patch of conditions that are still optimal, but the rest of that ocean basin is either adequate or marginal for corals and other kinds of organisms that make aragonite. If we go to 465 by 2050, even that adequate area is shrinking. And if we look at 2070, we can't even find adequate areas except for a little spot in the middle of the Pacific. So by this time, I mean, our children are probably still going to be working at this point. Maybe our grandchildren will be looking around and wondering what the hell happened to the corals. Because if we look at this, the corals are pretty much toast. What are some of the impacts? Well, let's start with corals, because they're sort of the polar bears. They're the seal cubs of the marine world that we can't see. And those of you who have been fortunate enough to go snorkeling or scuba diving on coral systems know that they are extraordinarily beautiful. They're extraordinarily biodiverse. But they also have a very important both economic and human impact on us. They cover less than 1% of the surface of the Earth's surface, but harbor a couple of million species. They have a net value, and there's all kinds of different ways of estimating net value, but about 30 billion US dollars per year in terms of fish and other sorts of marine resources at first sale. Tourism and recreation, about 10 billion. They feed about 1 billion people a year, and that's one of the connections into the development game, is that a lot of that food is actually for artisanal sorts of fisheries. And people really depend on this. It's not just a luxury food. This is a picture of coral reefs. The percentage of essentially carbonate generation, the reduction in the amount of solid stuff that's being produced compared with the present, if we're looking at 380 parts per million by volume, this is pre-industrial, 450 parts per million by volume, 560, 750. So compared with pre-industrial conditions, we can see that already now the coral production, the rate at which new corals and that hard material is being formed is reduced by about 20% compared with pre-industrial conditions. If we look at 450 parts per million, the rate goes down to half for a lot of those corals. If we look towards the future, 550, 560 parts per million, we can see that about 80% reduction in the rate at which solid material is being produced. So this is serious stuff. The fundamental link between atmospheric carbon dioxide and corals and aragonite formers is very, very closely tied. But corals, I mentioned, are sort of the polar bear. They're that fuzzy animal, sort of poster child for marine resources. But perhaps an even more important aspect has to do with organisms that we can't normally see. This is a particular kind of pteropod, Amelia huxleyi, I think is what it's called. What you can see here is, if you look down at E, down in the lower left-hand corner of the plot, and you look at the very edge of that pteropod shell, you can see a very nice sharp edge. That's what the thing should look like. If the same pteropod is grown in a microcosm with elevated carbon dioxide concentration, so it's growing in a slightly more acidic environment, then you can see at 3 different parts of that shell that it's clearly not as nice and sharp a picture as the healthy shell would be. So what's happening is that shell, or that organism, is spending more of its metabolic energy building a shell that's not quite as good. And because it's spending more of its metabolic energy doing something not quite as good as if it were completely healthy, it has less of that metabolic energy to withstand other sorts of disturbances. It is less resilient because it's been in a disturbed condition. If we look a little bit about when we might reach what's called aragonite saturation, that is, when the oceans might become corrosive to that kind of bug and to corals, and we look at the Southern Ocean The top part of these plots show the various different IPCC scenarios for future atmospheric CO2 concentration. So the upper scenario, which until the crash, we were following one of these worst case scenarios, or a green scenario down here. If we translate that into surface carbonate concentrations for the Southern Ocean, and ask the question, when, if we follow these paths, would we reach aragonite saturation? That is, when those ocean basins, or that ocean basin, would become corrosive to aragonite formers. We can see that that would happen about 2060. Now, that's the point at which, unless those organisms spend pretty much all of their metabolic energy just to make a not very good shell, they'll dissolve. Okay, that means that there's going to be a very, very large change in ocean ecosystems. So ocean acidification and development, I just wanted to leave with this slide, and hopefully this will generate some discussion a little bit later. It's an overlay of population growth and ocean acidification. So in terms of the map, the darker colored countries are where population growth is proceeding very, very rapidly. We can see that there's a swath in the tropical countries. That's exactly where ocean acidification impacts are going to be largest. So we can see there will be increasing populations. And if we look at Senegal, West Africa, for instance, there are lots of areas in which the population will be increasing. They are already dependent on fisheries and fish protein for a large part of their protein intake. And if we're at the same time exacerbating problems in terms of marine ecosystems by ocean acidification, then clearly this is a connection between climate change, ocean acidification, and development issues. We really need to be paying attention to these areas. I wanted to leave you with this, a couple of slides from Terry Garcia. This is what we can hope for. This is what we can dream of. This is the Millennium Atoll. Terry Garcia was there a couple of years ago. And National Geographic obviously knows how to make photographs. And this is an absolutely stunning photograph of the kind of coral systems that we'd like to see. Here's a bunch of bivalves that are actually filtering water, keeping it nice and clean. They're healthy. And the final inspirational one, maybe it's not inspirational if you're a diver, because maybe you'd like to get out of that water if this is what you're seeing. But nonetheless, these are the sorts of healthy corals and healthy marine ecosystems that we really like to have. So I think they're not all gone, and we really need to work to make sure that they don't go away. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I just have one brief question, and the rest of you will have to try to catch Kevin during the coffee break, because we're running a bit late. But when it comes to climate change, we start to discuss the geoengineering more and more. But will that help to solve the ocean acidification problem as well?
No, there's a couple of different geoengineering methods, one of which is, for instance, to put something in the atmosphere that reflects incoming solar radiation, bounces it back to space, cools down the surface of the planet. That wouldn't do anything to atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. It's almost to say a temptation to say, well, let's pump even more CO2 in the atmosphere. Ocean acidification and atmospheric CO2 are linked like this. And the only way to get around ocean acidification is to reduce the amount of CO2 we have in the atmosphere.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. A small gift for you as well, and another applause.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mickey.